Hello everyone. In our last session, we talked about the salient features of the Victorian age, its timeline, and few important terms which are associated with this era. We begin with the literature of the Victorian age today. We begin with prose first, and we divide prose into two parts, fiction and non-fiction. When we look at the features of Victorian non-fiction, few of the important styles and subjects that dominated the writings of the writers were: we see didactic essays and social commentaries on environment, politics and society, very popular during this age. We see historical tracts were popular and common among the writers. Polemical writings on issues like the problems of working class was also an area of interest. A great deal of critical thinking and writing on art and architecture was popular, which actually also influenced subsequent generations. As far as fiction is concerned, we have realism, social issues, multi-volume novel as becoming popular, writers experimenting with various genres, mystery thriller becoming popular with Wilkie Collins, industrial novel evolving as a genre, novel of manners and novel of sentiment, writers talking about moral and social codes and social problems. We will be taking up fiction in our next session. Today we focus on non-fiction. When we look back to the Romantic period, we see that the Romantic period marked the rise of personal essay. But during the Victorian period, the essay turned towards social criticism. The writers talked critically about the society. Some of the most important commentaries and analyses of Victorian society and culture, it came from figures like Thomas Carlyle. He was a popular non-fiction writer. The subjects included education, women's condition, science, religion, industrial capitalism, and empire. The first writer we see in this non-fiction category is John Henry Newman, popularly known as Cardinal Newman. He was one of the most influential figures of this age. He was a preacher and writer, and he usually attracted controversies for his views. We talked briefly about his role in the Oxford movement in our earlier session. He published his opinions in the work titled Tracts for the Times. He also published The Idea of a University, which is a very popular work till today. He was ordained as a cardinal in the year 1879. In his popular work, The Idea of a University, Newman defines the purpose of institutions. The second important writer is Thomas Carlyle. He was a prolific writer, and all of his works together, that is his collected works, they run into 30 volumes. He had set the agenda for rethinking issues ranging from French Revolution to science and education. His popular work titled Signs of the Times went on to influence whole generation of thinkers and writers. He frequently lectured and published a diverse range of subjects, including essays on the Negro question, that is Negro identity, he was interestingly in support of slavery, and his argument was that it kept order in society. He also favored Chartism and French Revolution. He was very much influenced by Dr. Johnson, Cromwell, etc. His tract on the French Revolution, it was earlier underscored as a non-heroic kind of a text. But in fact, he questioned the need for mass movement. We have to read into detail if you are interested in reading, because Thomas Carlyle's feelings and views about science, revolution, they were very ambivalent. As we have discussed earlier, The Science of Time is considered to be his most important work. Now, moving on to a book that revolutionized human thought in this period was Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species, published in 1859. What did Darwin do actually? Darwin argued that life evolved through a process of natural selection. He rejected creationism as unscientific. Darwin provided a model for evolution. He said life evolved from simple to complex. And with this, Darwin had radically undercut the basis of faith itself. The effect of this book, or The Origin of Species, on the society was enormous, because his theory rejected the need for an intelligent God, and his argument was that humanity had evolved from lesser and smaller creatures through a process of natural selection. And he completely rejected the idea of any intelligent design or God behind this. Now, this theory was unacceptable to even scientists. And Darwinian science, it became very popular in the early decades of 20th century. One more writer, science writer of the same period was T.H. Huxley. He is considered to be as the one who inaugurated the genre of science writing. Then we have J.S. Mill. He worked for several years at the India Office in London. His association with his father James Mill and Jeremy Bentham led him to philosophy and history, and his works on utilitarianism, political economy and ethics make him one of the most influential and extremely influential Victorian. J.S. Mill was one of the first men to speak on and advocate women's rights. He published on the subjection of women and on liberty. In his essay on liberty, he argued in favor of individual freedoms and rejected the monopolistic powers of the state. I just quote one line, very famous line from On Liberty. He writes, "Over himself, over his own body and mind, the individual is sovereign." He argued that governments and holders of power are to be limited, and he also argued that democratic principle and liberalism should be encouraged. Another writer of this period, we will talk about his utilitarianism in our next slide. William Morris, one more figure of this period. He is considered to be as an introducer of the medieval revival and Renaissance ideas and arts. His works on architecture included wallpapers, designs, murals and textiles. He was influenced very greatly by Karl Marx. He wrote Art and Socialism. He is also the author of fantasy fictions, few of them. Matthew Arnold is another figure who began his career as a poet, but he turned to prose later on. And we know Arnold from his theory on cultural criticism. He probably inaugurated what is now called as cultural criticism. Today we call it cultural criticism. His work, Culture and Anarchy, it was a masterly defense, considered as a masterly defense of literature. Matthew Arnold saw literature, especially classical or what we now actually call as elite literature, as the basis for a sound and healthy civilization. He said good literature is the only weapon against anarchy. His rejection of the Philistines. Now, what do we mean by Philistines here is those who were only interested in wealth and equated wealth with culture. He rejected barbarians, and this rejection was a humanistic attempt to highlight the absolute necessity of good literature. Culture, as per Arnold, or as defined by Arnold, he says, was the best which has been thought and said. That is, culture is something which is the best and which has been thought and said in this world. He also proposed that regionalism was equally barbaric and that Britain needed to return to European traditions as a whole. He attacked the Philippines, who did not appreciate creative minds, and actually they prevented the artists from working. According to Arnold, a cultureless society which despises poets and the poets which increasingly turn inwards, he worked against those Philippines. His another famous work was Essay in Criticism, the Study of Poetry, and where he argued that certain poets should be provided certain standards for writing subsequent literatures and so on. John Ruskin, another writer of this period, his subjects were wide, like geology and art. He wrote and theorized various forms from realism to symbolism. His work, Modern Painters, was the most famous tract. John Ruskin was influenced by classical and romantic ideas of art. He saw beauty in living things. And I quote a phrase from his own. He called them vital beauty. He rejected the heavily subjective first-person accounts of the Romantics. On the contrary, he said that great literature must present a balanced view of the world. Another famous work by Ruskin was The Stones of Venice, where he discusses the fall of great cultures. Unto His Last is one of his most important works. It is considered to be a work which deals with social economy. In this particular work, the aim of Ruskin was to provide a humanistic account of economics. He rejected the mechanistic accounts of economy that reduced, he said, workers to only machines. He argued that there is a dire need to curtail competition. And he also said that employers and factory owners must be generous in their treatment of workers. Mahatma Gandhi was greatly influenced by John Ruskin's writings. And his theory on art criticism, it influenced the founding of National Trust, the National Art Foundation, and other such institutions in India. One more writer, prose writer of this period was Walter Pater. He saw his age, that is the Victorian age, as a decadent. We have talked about aestheticism and decadence in our last session. His two famous works, the Studies in the History of Renaissance and another work, Appreciations, they are considered as attempt to recast aesthetics. He wanted to re-establish the notion of aesthetics. According to Walter Pater, art was a kind of imaginative reason. He called it imaginative reason. He pleaded for the pleasure of art as pure and harmonious. And he also proposed that the end or aim of any art was art itself and nothing more. That means it's only written for pleasure. And thus we see that emphasis on this sensual element in art was Pater's major contribution to aesthetics. One more thing that Pater advocated was that art was something that unified matter and mind, and also sensation and intellect. Now this was a brief discussion on the prose writers or the non-fiction writers of the Victorian age. In our next session, we'll be talking about fiction or novel writers of the Victorian era.